From the JAMA Network, this is JAMA Psychiatry Author Interviews. Conversations with authors exploring the latest clinical research, reviews, and opinions featured in JAMA Psychiatry.
Hello, and welcome to our listeners around the world. You're listening to the JAMA Psychiatry Author Interview Podcast. I'm your host and web editor, Dr. John Torous. Today, we're thrilled to be discussing a new paper that's been out for a couple months in JAMA Psychiatry, Once Weekly Semaglutide in Adults with Alcohol Use Disorder, a randomized clinical trial. We're about to speak with both Christian H. Hendershot, PhD, and Klara R. Klein, MD, PhD, from the Keck School of Medicine at USC in Los Angeles, California, and University of North Carolina School of Medicine, Chapel Hill, North Carolina, respectively. Across most of this year, we've seen increased interest in new weight loss drugs called glucagon-like peptide-1 receptor antagonists, more commonly known as GLP-1s. But what if these drugs could also do more than help with weight loss, potentially helping people with alcohol use disorder cut down to drinking? To learn more about if this is possible or how it can work, we're about to talk with the first and senior author on a study that was published earlier this year in JAMA Psychiatry. So thank you for joining us both, Dr. Hendershot and Dr. Klein. I want to jump right in and say, we'll use the term GLP-1s for these weight loss drugs for the purpose of this podcast, but what are these GLP-1s and how do they work and why are we all so excited about them?
So I'm Klara Klein. I am an endocrinologist and primarily a diabetologist. And so I can speak to how these GLP-1s have really revolutionized the care of people living with diabetes. So these are medicines that were developed for the treatment of diabetes. They help control glucose, and the way they work is multifold. There's many ways that the mechanism is multifold, as I said. In one way, for people living with diabetes, it acts on the pancreas to have the pancreas actually release more insulin in times when blood sugars are high. And so that's why it had been developed to treat diabetes. And over time, both in the basic and the clinical world, they realized that these medicines also do many, many other things, including they slow gut motility and they increase satiety. And so it was found that when you're using them to treat diabetes, they also induce weight loss. And now, as you can see, they've been developed for weight management as well. So it has many mechanisms in many parts of the body and particularly centrally in the brain.
And clearly, we're going to focus soon on this interesting alcohol use disorder application that you and the team explore in the paper. Let's just quickly review the background of where are we on alcohol use disorder and its impact on society and people. With so many wild things happening in the world, we forget sometimes that this is a very serious illness as well.
Yeah, so alcohol use disorder is a very common disorder. So roughly 1 in 10 adults in the U.S. will meet criteria for AUD in a given year, and close to 1/3 of U.S. adults will meet criteria in their lifetime. From a public health standpoint, the effects of AUD are pervasive. So, for example, we know that alcohol has a causal link with over 200 health and disease conditions, and that includes many of the most common conditions that impact society, including cardiovascular disease, stroke, and several forms of cancer, including breast cancer. From a public health standpoint, the effects of alcohol are not limited to what we would refer to as alcohol use disorder, but there's really a cascade of effects that spans many diseases in many areas of medicine.
What are the current approved treatments and kind of most common things that patients are offered in alcohol use disorder today?
So the good news is that we do have effective behavioral and pharmacological interventions. Most people who enter treatment at a given point will end up receiving a behavioral treatment. And so that might be something like meeting with a therapist or a counselor, talking with a physician, or attending mutual support groups like AA. We do also have 3 medications that have received FDA approval for AUD, and those are disulfiram, acamprosate, and naltrexone. And the interesting piece to that is that those are the only 3 FDA approvals at this point, despite the fact that the first one occurred in 1951. So when we're looking at a span of about 75 years, we've had 3 medications approved by the FDA formally for AUD. There are also a small number of medications that are used off-label. We also know that the medications that are available are very much underutilized. So for example, it's estimated that only 2% of those with AUD end up receiving medication treatment in a given year. So the treatments are out there, but the uptake has been suboptimal.
2% is a low number, but then 3 approved in almost 75 years. Those are strong statistics. And what gets really exciting about the work that you and the team did is you tried something truly novel by assessing whether GLP-1s may help with alcohol use disorder. How did you and the team even make this connection that we have this drug for diabetes, as you explained, Dr. Klein, we have alcohol use disorder? What started you guys on this line of research?
We started planning this study in 2020, and at the time it came out of a collaboration with a preclinical scientist at the University of Toronto, Dr. Paul Fletcher. And Paul had been working for some time in studying how appetite regulatory medications might affect responses to addictive drugs. So an important piece of context historically is that this is actually not a brand new idea. This is something that preclinical scientists had been studying for many years before clinical scientists started to conduct clinical trials. So it was really kind of a case of lost in translation where it took some time for the clinical trials to emerge. It is also important to note that there was one prior clinical trial of a GLP-1 receptor agonist in alcohol use disorder, and that study was started way back in 2017 by Anders Fink Jensen and his colleagues in Copenhagen. So that was really the seminal clinical trial that came out in 2021. So there is a precedent for studying this topic, but the clinical trials were really kind of slow to emerge. But really the impetus for our study was the preclinical research.
In the paper, and I encourage everyone to read the paper in detail. We can only cover so much in a podcast. But you say to do the study design, you had both a clinical, outpatient, and a lab component to the research. A lot of trials don't have these dual components. But let's just talk about what are those dual components and why is it so important for research like this to have that?
So this is something that we do in the addiction research space often, and this is called a phase 2A clinical trial. And what that means is that it's essentially an early phase clinical trial where we're really just trying to get a handle on whether we are getting a signal of the medication on alcohol use behaviors. So to do that in this case, we used a short-term clinical trial, but within that clinical trial, we also embedded human laboratory sessions. And essentially what we did is we brought people into the lab both before treatment and after 2 months of treatment. And we conducted sessions that involved alcohol administration and self-administration. And the idea there is that by bringing people into the lab under controlled conditions, we can potentially get a more precise and more powerful estimate of a medication effect on alcohol consumption. So that was the rationale in this case for combining those human laboratory and short-term clinical trial components.
What are we randomizing people who are not getting this drug that, again, affects the pancreas? What does a placebo GLP-1 look like?
The control condition was placebo injections.
In the study, who is going to be eligible and recruit for it? So you're saying this is a medicine for diabetes and usually administered by endocrinologists. It's not something that psychiatrists and psychologists are typically searching out patients and offering them it.
Yeah, I think it's really important when you're looking at these trials to understand who is actually eligible so you can apply it to the right populations. So the inclusion criteria for this study included people who had to be 21 of drinking age up to age 65. And they had to meet criteria for alcohol use disorder. So that meant more than 7 drinks for women and more than 14 drinks for men within a week. And they also had to have at least 2 heavy drinking episodes. That means 4 drinks for a woman and 5 drinks for a man in a single episode. They had to meet those inclusion criteria. They also couldn't be seeking treatment. So these are non-treatment seeking individuals. And they couldn't be actively trying to reduce their alcohol consumption. And then some really important criteria, they couldn't have been exposed to GLP-1 receptor agonists in the past, or they couldn't have used them. They couldn't be on weight loss medications. They had to meet a certain BMI criteria. Everyone had to have a BMI of 23 or above, and they could not have diabetes.
A strict criteria, but a reasonable one, given what you guys are looking for in studying. And let's quickly talk about the primary study outcomes and any other key measures listeners should be aware of. Again, the paper itself is packed full of so many other results, but let's talk about what the key measures are going to be that we're going to hear about soon.
The primary outcome for this study was actually alcohol self-administration in the laboratory. To accomplish this, we used a paradigm that's been developed previously to study medication effects in the laboratory. And essentially, we brought participants in. We got information about their favorites or preferred beverage. We made that beverage available to them for a drinking period of around 2 hours. And during this time, we just monitored alcohol consumption, including with breath alcohol measurements. So this was conducted in a lab setting that was almost like a dormitory or living room type setting. So it is an artificial environment. But again, this is a way to try to quantify medication effects on consumption more objectively.
Let's pretend I'm a person who enrolls in the study. What did I have to do and what dose of GLP GLP-1 did I get for how long if I enrolled?
So this is a short study, and the way that these medications are dosed is you slowly up titrate them. And so individuals were treated with semaglutide. They got, as per the package label, they were titrated. You have to stay on the 0.25 milligram dose. So that's a starting dose for 4 weeks, and then increased to 0.5 milligrams. And then at the very last visit, people could get 1 milligram, but there was some flexibility depending on tolerability if people would go up on their dose. But the important thing is that they were on a fairly low dose of this medicine, semaglutide.
And so it sounds like a pretty standard way you would use the medicine too, which is interesting. It's nothing out of the ordinary or that takes extraordinary efforts or you're kind of dosing people at midnight and trying to do these hard things. No. And
it's a once weekly medicine, which is really kind of amazing. And people would come in and get their dose once a week.
Yeah, I'm just thinking some of our psychiatric medicines are like 3 times a day for some of our patients. And it's hard to stay on them. The final sample was 48 people, 71% female, overall mean age of 39.9 years. Let's discuss those main results. And maybe let's break it up into the lab-based outcomes and the self-reported outcomes, or in a way that you two want to help us understand what are the big takeaways.
So essentially, we saw some pretty good correspondence between what we observed in the laboratory and what we observed in the natural environment based on participant self-reports. So in the laboratory, we found that for people who completed alcohol self-administration sessions, both before and after treatment, those in the semaglutide condition consumed significantly less alcohol at the follow-up. And we quantify that based on estimated grams of alcohol consumed, as well as objective breath alcohol concentration measurements. So that was the laboratory finding. And we complemented that by using interview-based methods to quantify consumption over those roughly 9 weeks of the trial. Based on the self-report data, what we found was that participants did not actually change the proportion of drinking days based on medication versus placebo condition. However, on days when they consumed alcohol, those in the semaglutide group consumed significantly fewer drinks per drinking day. And we also saw a decrease in the number of heavy drinking days over the course of the trial in the medication group versus the placebo group. In addition, we also saw a significant decrease in alcohol craving, which we measured weekly at clinic visits in the medication group.
Those results alone are fantastic. These are things we just don't see in our field. And as you said, we don't really have new treatments. I mean, that's truly spectacular to see something like that. Let's talk a little bit about the results maybe around engagement. And again, did they agree to the study? Was there good uptake? Was there good adherence?
We had a really good response in terms of participation in the study, and our follow-up rates were very good. Almost everyone in the medication arm was retained in the trial through the end of the study. So from a safety standpoint, that's a very good sign. One of the interesting things that we found in this study, as well as a related study that we did focusing on nicotine, was that we had a higher than usual proportion of female participants. So in each of these studies, the proportion of women was, at least 70 to 80%. So that's also a notable finding in that we seem to get good engagement from that population. And what we know from recent years is that rates of alcohol consumption and alcohol-related liver disease are increasing disproportionately in females. So this is potentially a treatment that might be useful in that respect.
Engagement is so difficult in behavioral health. In any condition, medication adherence is tricky. Behavioral treatments are hard to stick with. You seem to, in some ways with this study, have not cracked engagement, but engagement you're saying is not a trouble for you. And if you talk to anyone else doing clinical research or care, engagement often becomes the main thing. So what do you think are the implications of having this type of engagement for substance use disorder, alcohol use disorder here?
Well, I think it's important to keep in context this was, a single research study. We were paying people to come in. And so it's somewhat difficult to extrapolate that to the real world. But I think what is potentially very promising is that we know that these medications are very much in the public consciousness and they are very much in demand. So from that standpoint, we think that should additional research show that GLP-1 receptor agonists are effective for reducing drinking, from a dissemination standpoint, that's potentially a big advantage.
Let's say I'm listening, I'm a psychiatrist, I've tried prescribing those 3 FDA-approved medicines we've talked about. I have a patient who's not doing well. Is it ready that I can begin to think about offering my patient this? And I think I'll caveat around one of the inclusion criteria is people had to have the BMI, that they had to kind of meet the criteria for being overweight. So is this ready for people to be trying? And especially, what about people who were different than in the study, i.e. have a normal or a healthy weight, perhaps?
So this is a question that comes up a lot. And in fact, it is something that's happening in the real world. So there are people, choosing to pursue GLP-1 treatments for addiction. In the meantime, it is important to point out that we do have effective FDA-approved medications for AUD. That's kind of the first point. And the second point is we just really don't have the data yet in hand to recommend prescribing these medications off-label. That's not to say it's not happening, but from a clinical and public health standpoint, we just don't yet have the data at this point.
It's a really important thing to understand. I know that there's been a lot of interest. We both have been contacted about how to use these therapies. And I think it's important to understand it's a very encouraging, but a small study, and there are more studies to come. The BMI criteria was greater than 23, and the vast majority of people were a BMI above 25. I think Christian can correct me if I'm wrong. I think there was only a single participant who had BMI less than 25 in our study. So this idea about normal weight is really important. There was a lot of weight loss in people who are heavy alcohol users. It's really important to understand that there can be nutrition concerns. Weight loss may not be safe. It certainly could be. We just need the data. And so making sure that we're making evidence-based decisions is really important.
To your credit, you put this very clearly in the paper. You are not saying anywhere we should be using these. And you say this is the first step of evidence, and we're going to follow up on this. But speaking of the media attention that this paper has garnered, does anything surprise both of you just in how the media has covered it or things that have come up as you've got all this well-deserved attention?
Probably one of the most surprising things is that we're just not used to seeing this much public interest being paid to early stage research on a given treatment for addiction. It's gotten a lot of attention. Certainly the overall attention and excitement about GLP-1 medications does account for probably the majority of that interest. But there does seem to be something in particular about this relationship between GLP-1 and alcohol that seems to be just an appealing story, or maybe something that people can relate to. And optimistically, I think one good thing about all of the attention is that it does create an opportunity to open up a dialogue about the need for more AUD treatments, and also to remind the public that we do have some effective treatments available.
It's wonderful you guys have put this back into the public dialogue and making people think about different medical treatments and behavioral treatments that they can get help with. My last question is, the paper came out less than a year ago. The world moves fast, research moves fast, these drugs move fast. Is there anything that excites you guys in the team the most right now, where this is going, or future plans you have that you can share with us?
So we're moving on to some additional trials, both with alcohol and nicotine. And I think the most important thing to point out is that this is a very quickly moving field now, and even more so within the last year. So there's been almost an exponential increase in the number of clinical trials that have been registered on this topic. And it's probably something that we have not seen before in our field. Even within the last 3 to 4 weeks, we've seen 3 larger scale phase 3 trials registered publicly. So those trials will be underway soon. And I think in the next 1 to 3 years, probably we're going to learn a lot more about this topic, including probably 1 to 2 more clinical trials coming out within the next several months.
The field of incretin therapies is just exploding. So there's so many cool new molecules, potentially novel ways to deliver month-long therapies. There's all sorts of new things that are on the horizon, and what that means for this indication. There are lots of really amazing opportunities in the future. So it's so exciting to be part of it.
And it's wonderful to have both of you sharing the paper in detail with us. So that's all the time we have. Again, I'm John Torous, and I've been speaking with Dr. Hendershot and Dr. Klein about once-weekly semaglutide in adults with alcohol use disorder, a randomized clinical trial. To learn more about this research, you can find a link to the article in this episode's description. To follow this and other JAMA Network podcasts, please visit us online at jamanetworkaudio.com or search for JAMA Network wherever you get your podcasts. This episode is produced by Shelley Steffens at JAMA Network. Thanks for listening.
This content is protected by copyright by the American Medical Association with all rights reserved, including those for text and data mining, AI training, and similar technologies.